Yeah, and I guess I read your article about your trip to Japan.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
That's gee, it's
a while ago,
now
10 years
more than
ago.
10 years.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. 2005 or 2004.
yeah, and I guess I was just wanting some perspective from you. One of the things I get from a few people in Japan um, is kind of like, well, Japanese traditionally were doing permaculture,
Mm.
or traditional Japanese
Yeah.
life is permaculture,
Mm.
and stuff like that. And so I was just wondering, is that an accurate way to see things? Like,
Mm.
or what are the what are things that we could say that there is permaculture design, but maybe these parts are different. So
Mm.
yeah, just your perspective on that.
I think Japanese traditional culture and land use is a really good and still relatively intact, at least evidence of
Mm-hmm.
how that culture emerged in in response to the limits of an islands.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of the great cultures in the world of showing us how that worked in the pre-industrial state without dependence really on external empire, but with enough complexity to make it a bit relevant to the modern world.
Mm.
So up until the Meiji Restoration, in my understanding of it, there's this like exquisite evolved ecological design. But within that, from a modern perspective, some social structures that we would say maybe not
Mm-hmm.
desirable.
Mm-hmm.
So
Like feudalism.
yeah, yeah. But the core of feudalism is the land is the basis of wealth, and that's basically ecological. And so who controls the land and how the land's controlled is the structure of power. There's so many aspects of traditional Japanese society and land use that we can say is a model that could be applied or at least at the inspirational level and to some degree at the practical level elsewhere and rediscovered and reapplied in Japan. But if you say that the ecological design solutions for the future have already been found in Japan, and this is what is appropriate here, there's a number of ways in which that is not correct, and that there's need for consideration of other elements that weren't part of that traditional system. So the first is accepting that the biodiversity of the planet is huge compared with the biodiversity of any place. And even the biodiversity of similar climates provides another repertoire of possibilities. And this is already built into the past in Japan, that Moso bamboo, my understanding is it only came from China 300 years ago, so a time scale not much longer than European introduction of new plants into Australia. So that aspect of permaculture, of working with the appropriate biodiversity of the planet rather than just a place, and then secondly that...
Could you just say, so what might that look like?
Well, for example, when I was in Japan, people told me a lot about the disease that's affecting the Japanese pine. And, I said to some foresters we were with, I mentioned some other species which I'd seen growing, like, for example, Himalayan cedar, which is growing as an... And they said, oh no, this is just an ornamental tree. And I was saying, but it's growing very well. And they said, I know there are only 4 timber trees for Japan. Sugi, Hinoki, and yes, but no. And I know there's good reasons for a culture of tradition and conservatism and being sceptical about new things. But I think a permaculture perspective would try and look at that and say, well, maybe there are some other trees that could be grown, while avoiding the way that has happened in the West, where some vigorous growing exotic species become some vast monoculture that takes over everything, which is the problem of the monoculture in the mind more than the problem of the tree. So that would be an example. There could be other things. An example the other way of the need to rediscover the tradition is the value of millet, buckwheat, the older traditional grains that were a strong part of Japanese culture rather than just the rice domination. So that in a way is a rediscovery that is going on, with like the tsubu.
Tsubu.
Yeah.
And even before that, with potatoes and chestnuts.
Yeah. So, so I think there's a mixture where, yes, rediscovering the tradition and understanding the tradition is very important. But if we look at something like the effects of modernity and fossil fuel power in the world is not something that just completely disappears even if that whole society falls apart. For example, things like stainless steel will still be around in 1,000 years from now. Stainless steel is incredible material. So, any traditional blacksmith would have, never had that as a possibility. See ya. So there's, again, that's just a little practical example of something that is the byproduct of the modern world, which will still be here in thousands of years' time. Other things, again, thinking of metals, in a low energy future, when global trade declines even a small amount, there's going to be so many shipping containers in the world, which will be at ports and other places that will have no use. And we already have a sort of an architecture of containers. Now, whether they're the best thing to live in or whatever, we're going to have all these amazing, incredibly strong structural sealed things on unimaginable scale. So creatively reusing those, which is a classic permaculture mentality and practice, is something that has no precedent in the tradition, and it changes maybe the way one does certain things. So the other, of course, is at the psychological level and the social level and cultural influences, that there are so many ideas that in permaculture we can take from one place and apply in another. The biggest one, I think, is climate change, because I noticed in studying Fukuoka's work and looking at his rotations, one of my reactions was, how can the climate be stable enough to have such complex, precise rotations? In Australia, farming is very difficult inherently because the climate doesn't repeat itself in a seasonal pattern. So much so that, like in Chinese traditional medical view, Australia is really an uninhabitable place because the bad seasonal changes that affect the body from, through spring in the change of seasons, here is like that all the time. But people did live here, but they found agriculture very, very, Aboriginal people kept agriculture very, very simple and very, very robust, if you can call what they had agriculture, because of that huge change. And talking to farmers in Japan, of course, like everywhere in the world, the real experience of climate change is already happening, and people are saying, well, it didn't used to be like this. And what that means is a requirement for a huge flexibility that will involve change. So the way the ancestors did it is not necessarily now appropriate. So permaculture is adding a global reservoir of solutions, some of which are appropriate, some of which are not, and greater ways to use the culture of continuous change that has been happening in the West for the last 500 years, since the West got 2 free continents of resources in the Americas, and has been happening in Japan since the Meiji Restoration. This where every generation has to do something different to what the previous generation did. And so I don't see in my view of the future that change is going to slow down. I see that the direction of the change is highly likely to change from greater technological complexity to actually technological simplification. So we will need to go back to patterns, if not the exact formula for the way more of what our ancestors did. But in a world which has been fundamentally changed by the whole eruption of modernity in some of those ways, of new plants, new cultural ideas, new materials, even if, all the computers end up in just being salvaged for metals and there's no functional internet or whatever. So there will still be huge changes. And then, of course, there's the legacy of previously unknown problems like nuclear radiation. So for which, our traditions don't really have much answer other than the wisdom of indigenous people who lived near concentrated uranium sources, often had stories that, no, you don't touch that mountain. So I think if I shift the story back from Japan, where there's a very strong case for saying an important part of permaculture in Japan is the rediscovery of tradition, much more so than in Australia, where our knowledge of indigenous pre-European culture is fragmentary, and where the world has changed so much that we can only use smaller parts of that knowledge, whereas a greater proportion of what's needed in Japan is still in the reservoir of the tradition. But so here in Australia, even explaining permaculture to older traditional rural people, sometimes they would say, but isn't permaculture just common sense, this thing that everyone knows what to do? And I'd say partly, but it's no longer common. So it's part of what permaculture is. But I think the balance, there's 2 ways my sense in Japan was of some people having that response, that's just tradition. And so therefore there is nothing new. But there is, because it is being lost. So rediscovery. But going the other way, where people say, oh no, permaculture is all these new ideas. And sometimes I saw that too, where people, the the modern situation, and especially since the American occupation, of all the important things come from somewhere else, and Japan just adopts them and adapts them. That all the cool ecological innovations come from America or Australia, and sometimes that can lead to that opposite problem of trying to sort of adopt something which is not necessarily relevant. And I think in my essay I sort of questioned the idea of straw bale in Japan as an example of that, of whether it was really that appropriate for a number of practical reasons, but it was an example of something this is the cool latest thing type of. So I think there's obviously that debate must go on all the time in Japan, and permaculture is both, I think.
Both.
Yeah, it's both the new, but using permaculture principles as a sort of lens to try and filter what that is new is relevant, and the same to look back at the tradition and say, what of that tradition is relevant? Another example would be, it was explained to us that the apparently subtropical design of traditional Japanese houses for maximum airflow, for comfort in the summer, and yet they didn't seem to perform very well in the colder winters. That there seemed a curiosity around the notion that, traditional designs actually reflect what is practical in an environment. This is sort of feels like subtropical architecture. And then someone pointed out to us that with the silk manufacture in traditional houses, the diseases that could run rampant through the silk if there wasn't enough air movement could destroy the economy of a whole village, and that the houses were set up for maximum ventilation rather than comfort in the winter to protect the silkworms. And you say, well, in a world where there are more clothes than we need for the next 2 or 3 generations, yes, one day we need sustainable clothing again, but it's nowhere near as urgent as sustainable food, because we need food every year. That maybe, the whole architecture literally and the design of everything around silk manufacture might be an aspect of tradition that might not be so important.
I also heard resource scarcity.
Right.
Like just limited amount of lumber, because Japan has cut down almost their entire forests
in the past.
Yeah, and so most of Japan, well, not most, but a huge part of Japan is reforested.
Yeah. Well, my understanding is that in the 13th century it got down to 30% forested. That by the time of Meiji Restoration it was 78% forested, and then the really interesting thing in terms of a culture of sustainability, and in spite of the needs of the empire and the expanding rapid industrialisation, the restrictions on overcutting the forest still only led to it getting down to 60% in the 1930s or something. And that is an amazing restraint, cultural restraint, that must have been that conservatism. No, you do not cut the mountain forest, because of the deep learning of what happened last time, which the explanation I had is basically all the rice paddies were being covered by boulders as big as houses, and it was just like a period of terrible disaster, and then a period of strong emperors led to the replant the mountains. So, like we see, there's an example of, in the modern world, how that traditional conservatism acted as a brake on Japan raping its forests again. Of course, it then went to Southeast Asia and China and did that elsewhere. But that was outside the domain, you know, like where different rules apply. You know, but of course, buildings can be built in ways that are thermally more efficient for winter, with better insulation and things like light earth structures and mud renders over straw, sort of micro sort of versions of things like straw bale, to modify the traditional house designs without necessarily using more timber. So I mean, another example of this is, of course, the way glass has become so cheap in the industrial world, which makes passive solar design possible. You know, I mean, the Greeks and the Romans built buildings that were effectively passive solar oriented for the sun to come right into their buildings, but they had no glass. You know, so they sort of worked a little bit, but you know, so that is another transformative material. You know, it possibly doesn't last quite the way stainless steel does, but it's sometimes once a technology is being developed, even in a society that loses technological complexity, once the value of something is established, a society going into energy descent can manage to maintain that for a long while easier than develop it in the first place. So, you know, now that we know how valuable glass is, we, you know, beyond just a glass you know, container, but actually to have sheet glass and windows, that's, you know, a possibility. I mean, another example of adaptive design, I was shown some of the white mulberry plantations that were growing near houses to be cut for feeding the silkworms, and told that this was now a very rare form of land use, and these mulberry pollarded trees were sort of like a special conservation thing. And I was saying, oh, this is a very good animal fodder system to feed goats. And, you know, in a modern context, you could say, oh, well, we can have some milking goats, and rather than just being in a barn fed hay, and they could be fed the tree fodder, which is their natural preference, and that would actually help maintain this traditional cultural landscape, but in a different context. So permaculture is sometimes about playing with the, you know, the tradition and seeing something that can be a new use found.
Yeah, changing the elements or tweaking the design.
Yeah. I mean, another aspect that, like what we were talking about before, of how so many people lived on such small islands without the support of outside resources, whereas now the world is such at the moment where everyone is living from the oil well, and technology and wild nature is taking back over Japan in the rural, you know, in the countryside. So some of the very refined, efficient ways of doing things that just manage to support the most people of the least land are not the high priority now. And one example would be if animals were a small part of the traditional cultural system, because it's more efficient to grow food and feed people than to feed things to animals and then eat the animals. And if there's enough people in a low energy society, people can do all the physical work that animals could do, or we now have fossil fuels. So the transition back to full tradition and the work involved in going up the mountains and doing everything by hand and saying, are we going to give up fossil fuels and go straight back to that? There's animals represent actually a middle step that obviously European society developed to an enormous degree, you know, and it's what allowed them to, one of the things that allowed them to conquer the Americas, you know, the horse and working animals and animals eating in the landscape is an alternative to machines, herbicide, or the 80-year-old man with the karma. You know, that there's another sort of tool in the kit. And so that shift from animals are precious and valuable and they are in a stable and we bring the food to them. Oh, animals can actually be useful in the landscape. And that's an idea that is totally normal in Australia, but I found amongst Japanese farmers it was like a really strange idea. You know, I was somewhere in Chiba with a farmer who was an organic farmer, was handing the business over to the son and was very interested and involved in permaculture, and their farm was his wife's family farm, and it was the area where one of the commercial crops in the boom times in the 80s was advanced trees for transplanting and lots of ornamental things growing on sandy soils, and now a lot of these businesses don't work, and there was lots of things that had run wild, like little ornamental bamboos, and he was talking to me about this bamboo, and it's a real problem, and how do you get rid of it? And I was looking at flat, sandy soils, and I thought, pigs would just dig this up and, you know, eat it. And he said, can pigs live outside? You know, and yeah, of course, that's their natural environment. You know, but from that traditional perspective, I know a pig is an animal in a shed and you bring it food, you know. So, yeah, there's a good reason that, you know, with the number of people all trying to live from those islands before the Meiji Restoration, even the pig is less efficient than people. Grow more food for people, people do the work. And obviously a cow is even more inefficient. You know, so you can see that things of why in Japan that traditional animals, you know, ducks, fish, you know, and of the big animals, sort of pigs, but, you know, not very strong tradition with animals like goats, whereas in terms of working back complex vegetation that's taking over landscapes, these animals are really, really useful. And so there sometimes, you know, there is no tradition, there's no precedent in the tradition, that, or you have to go to some special one locality where there was a different landscape or something, which is the same thing as permaculture, saying, you know, maybe in Hokkaido people did something different because it was a different climate, and that now is appropriate.
Yeah, and traditions, it's like, whose tradition, you know? Because traditions are always changing, and so it's also, this concept of tradition is very man-made and...
So yeah, I think it's but you know, there's one aspect of Japanese culture that, at least from a Western perspective, design seems to have been embedded from a very early stage as an aspect of tradition, and that is very unusual. It's almost like a proto-modern sort of thinking, because design involves imagining what does not exist, whereas tradition is often just doing what the grandfathers did, and then when you are an old wise person, you can have the discretion to change one little thing when you are the master. You know, but the idea that you would imagine something completely different is foreign to most traditions, and that design thinking seems to, from our perspective, to have been quite a strength of of Japanese culture, and I don't fully understand how deep that goes back, or whether it was actually the Japanese response to modernity with the Meiji Restoration, because it almost seems like the elite of Japan sat down and said, looked at the West and said, we need to design a completely different society. What do we need? Maybe we need a strong emperor again, and we need this, and that's like they designed a society or something, and then just, went full steam ahead with it, which seems like an amazingly modern thing to do, like postmodern. Quite extraordinary, and how fast that happened. Yeah. I still, struggle to realise when I think, the steel industry in Japan was, in 1900, was as advanced as the steel industry was in Australia. And we were part of this powerhouse of the industrial world, from the beginning out of, whereas in Japan it was, the 1860s, and then the elite woke up and said, we're going to go a completely different way. And in 40 years it would sort of caught up to the Western world. So I think there are some things about that which, not necessarily the details of it or what the objectives of that were, but they tell us a lot about the capacity to respond to emergent large-scale change from the outside that you can't control. And climate change is like that, and effectively the peaking and decline of fossil fuels is like that, apart from also the genie out of the bottle problems like nuclear radiation. They are things to some extent that you have to adapt to. You don't have the power to change those external forces, but you have the power to redesign your own systems.
And maybe, I guess, what might contribute a little to that is just how disaster prone the islands are. I mean, regular earthquakes and volcanic activities and tsunamis, and so it's just kind of like it's almost like you have to design for disaster all the time.
So
big changes.
And that's something that Japan had that Western Europe didn't have, because it was a remarkably stable, both physically in the landscape and in terms of not much in the way of intense storms like typhoons and through most of Western Europe, not the earthquake movement problems.
And what would you say for people who in Japan who are just getting into permaculture as a lifestyle change? Because I think usually it's more the middle class people who are kind of tired of their jobs or don't really want to even go into that kind of like selling your life for money. So for those people and for people who have been doing permaculture and what do you think is some of the most meaningful things we could be doing in Japan?
Well, everyone's situation, of course, is very different, and there's a great spectrum of difference in Japan, from obviously the city to the rural areas, as well as people's life stage is very, very important. I think, especially for older people, the idea of consolidating in situ where one's connections are, family, local resources, things that work without the monetary economy, that those sort of relationships are very important in terms of a consolidation often, and sometimes for younger people the building of skills that you carry that to be useful wherever you go. rather than just to have skills that can, where you can work for a corporation or work for the government, and without that structure, your skills aren't actually useful. So it doesn't matter whether that is food growing or being able to fix a machine or a car, or being able to be a good observer of what other people need, so you can slot into something and rapidly identify what's needed and put effort into that. Whatever those skill sets are, skill sets that are directly useful to other people. And that, much more than a university qualification, something is something you carry with you and is transactable everywhere. It's useful everywhere. And that provides a huge flexibility to sometimes be fairly minimalist in possessions and flexible about where you can go. So I have talked about this in the Australian context in my retro suburbia framework, between the imperative to consolidate where you are, or to migrate in the sense of move to where opportunity is, or and it's easier to move when you have minimal possessions, minimal attachments. It's more important to consolidate when you have a lot of built social and connections to place. So permaculture really can enable people to do that audit of their whole life, as looking at their life as an ecosystem. What is all their relationships? Who do they depend on? Where do things come from? Where does my food come from? Where does my water come from? Who are the people I depend on in an emergency or an illness? What is the ecology of my life in that total sense? And then to look at what are the things that are most easy to change that will increase happiness from doing very little, rather than happiness dependent on acquisition, and to increase resilience to unexpected change or difficulties, whether that's from personal illness right through to global climate change or tsunamis, or political change. So resilience and happiness are, I think, more important than productivity, efficiency. It's good not to throw efficiency away completely, but in our society there's been much too much emphasis on it, and it's often the enemy of both happiness and resilience, because resilience depends on a lot of flexibility, a lot of built-in redundancy. Oh yes, we could do this, but we've got this backup. And you look at that, it's inefficient to be like that. It's much more efficient to be specialised, and so to become more of a generalist in what you do. And so that for a lot of people is a reconnection to nature and a reconnection to basic needs. And so gardening is so central to most people's understanding of permaculture for very good reasons, because it can fulfil so many of those things. The reconnection to nature, better health and fitness, greater resilience, and having a useful skill, and so many things that it does, which is not surprising why, either with an understanding of permaculture or whether just with intuitive understanding, so many people are attracted to gardening, and especially food gardening.
And this is maybe similar to Australia, but I think when a lot of people associate food production or working in the field, there's just this kind of like really negative image, like it's hard work, you got to be in the sun, you make very little money, you know, so there's a real unpleasant association to that way of life, which seems quite different from my experience being on permaculture farms or organic farms, and I think it's really different how you're conceptualizing it versus how most modern people envision it. But what is it that makes that difference, you think?
Well, there's difference at a number of levels. I mean, firstly, the ruthless efficiency of modern industrial agriculture makes it, for one thing, incredibly boring. You know, if you're weeding a row of carrots, which is, 500 metres long, it can get boring. Whereas if you're working in a mixed garden with many different things, yes, there is work, and yes, it can be repetitive, but not that ruthless, repetitive efficiency of the factory, you know, or the industrial agriculture. So that diversity of tasks is a key difference. Secondly, there's the creation of more harmonious environment that is working in a landscape that is smaller scale, mixture of trees and small fields, where there is other life forms, birds, and where the environment doesn't feel like a threat that, well, they're about to spray this field and we're not supposed to go in there for the next 2 days, or all of those aspects of industrial agriculture that are like really life-threatening, or that a permaculture or organic farm feels somewhere that once we reconnect with our sort of basic self, actually feels at home. Now, for someone who's only ever lived in an apartment, maybe it doesn't feel at all at home, and nature feels a very foreign place to be. There's no real easy answer to that question other than starting by small steps, you know, whether it's growing a small balcony garden or engaging in a reconnection with nature in some way, but the assurance that people in the past have felt very at home, that this is actually a very comfortable place to be. I think there's also the aspect that when we have the choice to do hard physical work, that feels very different from when we are forced to. So if we feel we are forced to work for money, many people will naturally choose to do so in a way that doesn't involve hard physical work. But if we have a choice in what we do, a sense of some degree of autonomy, some degree of sense of abundance and support through things other than just earning money, through reciprocity and gift exchange, that we then are engaged in a way where there's a much greater sense of choice. And therefore, you know, what is the difference between sweating turning a compost heap and sweating in the gymnasium on the exercise machine? You know,
and you have to pay for it.
Yeah, you have to pay for it, and it doesn't do anything productive.
Maybe it generates the electricity for your TV.
Yeah,
you're looking at as you run.
Yes, that's, whereas, you know, working at its best, working in a complex organic farm system is not just one's labour, it's actually attracting all of one's observational and intellectual capacities. A friend of mine who started out as a client, consultancy client of mine, he had been a merchant banker and then he had given up merchant banking and was farming. And he said to me, he said, "This is the most intellectually challenging thing I've ever done."
Mm.
And he'd been one of those traders who work out, you know, how he advised big investment funds on how to deal with the uncertainties of the market, not making guesses, but how to strategically, you know, very high level stuff. And he said farming was the most intellectually challenging thing he'd ever done. So there's plenty of opportunities to use the mind and the observation and combine it with physical work. And I think that is to be able to gain all those things, you know, so many things that people currently pay for, like like being physically fit, yeah, as well as, you know, the sense of empowerment that comes with producing something that is directly useful to you and directly useful to other people is a deeper, more fundamental sense of worth than I do this job that society is prepared to pay for at the moment. But actually, I think the job is what a Dutch economist has called bullshit jobs. That something like 30% of the jobs in various European countries, when people are surveyed, even the people doing them think they are bullshit jobs. That really society doesn't actually need this. So that is a very depressing thing to be in that situation. Yeah, and there's probably another 30% who are doing bullshit jobs but have convinced themselves that it's useful.
Yeah.
And there's maybe a third which are actually really useful.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that erodes people inside, whereas it's hard to argue that growing food for people is not useful. You know, so, yeah, many different reasons.
And so you're like sort of like the originator of permaculture, or associated with that, and with Bill Mollison collectively, and you've been doing this for what, over 40 years?
Well, I met Bill Mollison when I was 19. We developed the permaculture concept in the few years following that. So it's certainly been all my adult life, which is, so it's over 40 years. So yeah, it's a long time in my life, and obviously it had elements and roots going back before that for me, and but certainly since that, I describe myself as the co-originator of the permaculture concept, but I say Bill Mollison was, as well as the co-originator of the concept with me, he was also the father of the permaculture movement, because it was the one who had the energy to take and extend the teaching. I mean, I was a little bit involved in that, but I was a little bit an observer of it in its first 10 years.
Yeah. And so as you've observed the spread and the evolution and changes, and you've also, written books about, what future pathways we have available, and it's looking pretty grim, the pathway we're choosing as collectively. Yeah. So, what is your kind of perspective on what's the most meaningful things we can do, it would have been great, and still would be great, if we have this awakening that before things really start to collapse, before people really start running out of food on a mass scale, that we could be like, hey, this is crazy, let's shift, let's do these permaculture designs on a larger scale. But it doesn't seem to really be getting there yet, and it seems like we're gonna, maybe on a basic large scale movement, we're gonna be in denial until we're like being hammered down. But yeah, what do you think through
Well,
your journeys?
I suppose what has been clarified for me is the intuitive understanding that I had when I met Bill Mollison, and that for him was emerging, for him in middle-aged, was that we thought it was more useful to try and change the world by changing yourself.
Mm-hmm.
That rather than fighting against the bad things that were happening, that we were going to create the good things just to the extent that we can, and project that into the world rather than trying to resist the bad things.
Mm-hmm.
So that did have a political aspect to it that most people from a political and a social change activist perspective often don't see in permaculture, because they see permaculture is about this internal looking after oneself rather than changing the big structures.
Mm-hmm.
What I think has happened in that time is the efforts to mobilise mass change.
Mm-hmm. Just interrupt 2 seconds.
Yeah.
Ken's going at about 5.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe he can drop you off the bus, he
Okay.
said.
Cool.
Yep.
Wonderful.
Going anyway.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, so if we look at the efforts to bring about mass change by grassroots processes, but processes that are essentially aimed at convincing elites to change direction and use their power to steer the ship in another way, that those have, while winning some battles, have basically been losing for the last 40 years. And that a lot of those movements build on older traditions where they encourage a mass population who's been in some way deprived to be granted their fair share. So these are mass movements calling for more.
Mm-hmm.
But what we need, at least under the global middle class of possibly 1.5 billion people, is a mass movement calling for less.
Mm.
That doesn't seem very likely historically, even though we can point to all the positive things that will come from such an idea. And we see this in the environment movement, how the environment movement tries to sort of paint that we can have a very different world, but it will somehow still be a world of more.
Mm-hmm.
And
Kind of like George Bush said, the American way of life is non-negotiable.
yeah,
At the Earth Summit.
yeah. So I think also we have seen examples of mass movements where they achieve majority status, and I don't know what the position of numbers of people in Japan who are, thought the nuclear power stations should be closed down, but I understood it was actually quite a large number of people, or the number of people in Australia who are opposed to Australia going to the war in Iraq in 2003, but we still went anyway. So that most of those views of how you change society focus on that, how you get over the 50% mark, and then you have a majority, and then you can force change. Well, the evidence is that if you really want to steer the system in a completely different direction to what it's been going, you need a lot more than 50%. You may need 80%. And then if the elites respond to some urgent mass movement, whether it's about climate change or just a voluntary simplicity, reducing consumption totally, the attempt to implement that from above will inevitably create a degree of chaos and even disasters, because the system is now so complex that even well-meaning action from above, reflecting people's rights and desires and social justice and ecological common sense doesn't necessarily come about without chaotic and even destructive change. Because the system is so complex, we don't really know how to manipulate it at that scale to not have completely wild, unpredicted outcomes. Inherent structural complexity that is beyond design to some degree. On the other hand, if we say what is needed is whole system change, the most palpable whole system that is undeniable is the self. So like in the permaculture flower, we are connected and dependent on each and every one of the petals of the permaculture domain. Now if we look at that as a whole society, that's a huge redesign process. But if we look at it itself, we can say, how can I start to change my relationship to all of those 7 domains of the permaculture flower? Through that process of whole system redesign at a small scale, and then in our household and how we earn our livelihood and out in community, there's a learning cycle that builds through that. But also, when we change as a person, and especially as a household, the first level of sort of economic organisation, we provide an example or a model for other people to change. And those other people can change because they can see is at a scale that they can do something about. Yeah, like that. Well, they did that. Surely we can do that. It's not doesn't look
And
that
it's
complicated.
based on reality. It's not like something will happen in the future. It's
Yeah,
like you can see it.
Or they should do this. It doesn't have those wild uncertainties to it. Now there still are difficulties because actually those people had different skills and they're in a slightly different place, and nothing ever works exactly the same when replicated, especially when you're dealing with the natural world rather than the technological world, and you're dealing with people and their very different capacities and whatever. But when you get that viral replication, rather than growing in scale, the household doesn't grow from being successful to be, 200 people. No, there's another household that is sort of copying what they're doing. So that copying process results in mistakes and a learning cycle. But the mistakes are small, and the potential is for that to happen without the gatekeepers of the government, the banks, the media. So the gatekeepers who control the law, the finance and the knowledge, those are all breaking down for multiple reasons. But their ability to control the household non-monetary gift economies have always been very limited anyway, because those things happen like under the radar. They're a level below what those structures were ever set up for. So that means people can just say, yes, we'll do that. We just decided to. And they can use their savings or their skills. They don't have to get permission. So the greatest freedom is at that level. The higher up you go, there's the more power to act, but the narrower the band within which you can act, because other forces are restricting you. And so finally, when you get to the head of Mitsui Corporation or the Prime Minister of Japan, you have very limited, you have this great force of power, but you don't have much ability to steer away from. Whereas at that household level, at the personal level, we have this huge capacity of choice. So as that spreads, if that is giving the activists and the people who are the initiators, the innovators and experimenters who will start this sort of process, if they are getting a reward from that, like it's better for them, that is much more attractive than, oh, there is an activist who's sacrificed their life for the cause and, you know, had a terrible time. Why would anyone want to copy that? And yet a lot of social justice and political activism is that we must sacrifice ourselves for the cause. But that's not actually attractive. Whereas if we are actually enjoying what we are doing, that's a model to copy. So, and I think that's part of the permaculture message. This is just a better way to live. You know, we're having more fun. And so that even if it is actually a world of less. So how do you make a world of less attractive to 1.5 billion middle class people on the planet? And they're the ones numerically more than the elite, which are actually literally eating the planet. Because there's not enough of the elite to sort of, they can only eat so much food, or yes, they can have 10 Ferrari cars, but beyond a certain point, the elite can't really, you know, consume the world. It's pretty much the middle class people, which of course in Japan and Australia is virtually everyone in the society. So it's a I think permaculture is a different message in the disenfranchised two-thirds world. It's very relevant there, but it's a slightly different message. So, and there's other advantages from that process, because if that is then attractive and other people copy it, then some of the research on innovation shows that when about 20% of people in a community are doing some new thing, the people who are not doing it start to feel like they're in the minority. And we've seen this in community projects in Australia where there's been change at a street level with things, permaculture type things, and the people not involved start to feel they're the minority when only 20% are doing it, which is really curious. So there's this
tipping point.
Yeah, there can be a tipping point. Now the tipping point will always depend on the larger economic and social conditions changing, because the majority of people respond to what are all my social peers doing and what are the direct economic signals and rewards. So the redevelopment of the household economy will actually happen when the monetary economy contracts. And we know that historically, it always has. But it will happen in a much better way if there are really good models for it that are ready to scale up. Now, one argument is that if that doesn't happen, then only those who are ideologically committed to that way of life will continue. And the enthusiasm and the fun of it and the novelty and all the good things will fade as people sort of go back to, it's just easier to go back to dependence. So there's an argument that you can be too radical and ahead of the wave and become too disconnected from your society and be considered mad or crazy and not get enough social reward for it to be successful. But there's also the danger of being too late, where there's not enough sense of there are solutions, where people then are much more desperate and frightened and become more susceptible to all of the other forces, like the forces of fascism, where elites are saying, you are in such a bad state because of all those people over there, or this other foreigners, or, you know, all of the same old stories that have been around. But if there are many, many examples of people doing well and being able to, a sense of being able to be part of that, then that can act as a positive tipping point. Now, there's other factors that make this a really good strategy for change beyond that. I mean, that's quite a lot of factors given that this is actually a good strategy. But if this were to happen, say, I suggested in the essay, Crash on Demand, Welcome to the Brown Tech Future, that if 10% of the global middle class withdrew 50% of their work, 50% of their capital and 50% of their consumption out of the central corporate government-controlled economies and put it into the local, mostly monetary household economies, which is sort of about, I would say, roughly where we are, or a bit less than where we are, then that would result in a 5% contraction in the global economy. That would have a real effect, and it would act as a huge brake on the global machine that all activists now acknowledge is eating the planet and killing us through climate change, if not a million other ways. So that would be noticed by the power structures because the system depends on constant growth. So it's not, you don't need a majority of people doing something different to have a real effect, a real effect. Now that initial effect is very negative on the centralised system, and some environmentalists are now at a point of saying, we must stop the global economy. This is like, we don't, you know, this is our last chance.
Or take down the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah. That well, whether these things can be separated out, I mean, this is one of the arguments. A lot of the mainstream environmentalists who are focusing on divestment are saying we want to pull down the money out of the fossil fuel industry as rapidly as possible. I've suggested in that essay that if that were to happen, it's quite possible that would actually crash the whole world economy because it's such a huge shift so fast. Apart from the technical issues, the financial ruptions that would represent could actually crash the global economy like it was going to happen anyway in 2008. And is likely in any case...
But it's quite resilient.
Well, it appears to have been resilient, but it's through processes that have increased the risks of further financial instability. So it's actually put what is now has to be dealt with is at least twice as bad as the financial instabilities. Some would argue an order of magnitude worse, and that's all, you know, unravelling now. Of course, they kept pulling rabbits out of the hat to keep that going, and I won't go into all the ins and outs of.
Yeah, and I gotta go in about 5 minutes. So.
Yes, yeah. So just to complete that strategy, the possibility is that elites could say, these people are a threat to the centralised economy, we must crush that. If this is all small distributed activity, it is very, very hard to stop. It's very, very hard to squash all of these little things. If it's one big project, it's very easy to crush. The other possibility is elites might say, what do you people want? And then you have the start of an actual basis for a political discussion because you have some power, some autonomy, and say, oh, well, we have these ideas. Now, if none of that happens and the system falls and collapses to some degree, then all of these little places are little lifeboats that can help build whatever comes next. So it seems to me there is no downside in that strategy.
Except if you live next to the Fukushima nuclear power plant.
Yeah, well, I think we have to accept that wherever we are, there are huge vulnerabilities. I mean, we live with what I think is a much more modest problem, but in the worst bushfire region in the world, and all the science says it's going to get worse. And if that centralised economy collapses, we at the moment have all these airborne firefighting services that even come from right across the continent and target fires and all of that will fail.
Yeah.
And we will have to deal with that. And we plan to deal with that, which is, I think, a bit easier to plan to deal with than Fukushima.
Yeah.
But it's a very real, everywhere there is,
Some kind of.
yeah, and yeah, so I think the strategy of getting our own house in order, changing how we live ourselves as an example, and projecting that as a positive experience to those who are interested, rather than trying to convince people who are not interested. I don't think there's any point in trying to convince people who are not interested. Is works at many different levels. There's no certainty that we can avoid the pain and suffering that's coming from the unravelling of the global system, and no certainty that we can even insulate ourselves as individuals or households or communities from that. But it is, I think, the most powerful thing we can do, and we can have more fun than anything else doing it as well. So permaculture, in a way, does have a political instinct for change behind it, but it's not. Someone has said that permaculture is revolution disguised as gardening.
Cool.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah,
That was great.
welcome. Let's see where.